Welcome to Influence Interviews, where my mission is to introduce you to people who will have a positive impact on your business because of their expertise, their experience, and their example of great leadership. Today, my guest is Rick Willeford, owner of DentaMetrix, a software solution for dental practices who want that advanced practice analytics. It's an amazing tool for consultants who are partnering with dental practitioners to sort through all that noise and all the numbers and give you understanding with data you can trust. Rick is also the founder of the Willeford Group, a nationwide dental CPA firm whose mission it is to build practice health and secure personal wealth with proven financial strategies. Rick is an influential member of the dental community, giving back through speaking and educating internationally, in addition to the incredible software DentaMetrix. Welcome, Rick. Thank you for sharing your time with our audience today.
Hey, Laura, my mother couldn't have written that better if I tried. How you doing this morning?
I'm doing great. I love your platform. I'm excited to tell our audience all about the great things you're doing. Tell us a little bit about your career in the accounting space and how it led to the creation of the DentaMetrix platform.
All right. Well, I've got an interesting background. I was a dental CPA for 40 years, and that started before we even knew there was such a thing as a dental CPA. And as you know, with CPAs, you think of profit and loss and tax returns. And so a doctor would bring us his records and it would show, let's say, $1 million worth of revenues to do his tax returns on. So the typical CPA is going to take his expenses as shown and try to reduce his taxable income and get his income tax down. Well, I was strange in that I always looked also at the top line, that is the revenues. Where did the $1 million of revenues come from? Typical CPA wouldn't particularly know or care. They're just grabbing the expenses that they see, but we'd also know what expenses looked odd since we specialize in working with dentists. But the top line revenue, I always often wondered, could it have been 1.3 million or 1.4 million if they had done some practice management in their practice? So that was always curious to me. And so 20 or 30 years ago, I also got involved with practice management consulting groups, Speaking Consulting Network, Academy Dental Management Consultants, ADOM, things like that, because there are a lot of consultants there. And I was the only CPA at those kinds of meetings for many, many years. Mm-hmm. So I've always loved that part. Let's find opportunities to enhance your revenue. And so I facetiously tell the doctors, but it's true, Doc, my objective is to have you pay more income taxes. What? What do you mean? Well, if you pay more income taxes, that means you must have gotten more revenues, and they don't take it all. So you would have had some more. So I sold the Willeford Group practice. We were out of Atlanta, to my partner and daughter, Kate Willeford. And many of you see her on the internet with various webinars and talking about the COVID PPP and all that kind of stuff. And so fortunately, since I sold that 5 or 6 years ago, I haven't had to fiddle with that. But what I did was, as I sold that CPA practice, I dusted off my electrical engineering degree from Georgia Tech, and we enhanced DentaMetrix. DentaMetrix really was a dream we had inside our own practice for about 20 years, but we only used it with our own clients. And so I wanted to soup that up, and that got into things other than your QuickBooks, other than your overhead and tax returns, but got into examining the revenue. Where did that come from? How could we improve it, et cetera?
Right. Amazing.
And so we released that, but we had a pro version we released just through consultants, because we think that they are the real link in the chain that's critical to explain to the practices what all these numbers mean. Because we would have clients who go off and buy analytical kind of software and other toys, as you know, but after about 2 or 3 months, they'd wander off. They weren't using it. It felt like they were drinking from a fire hydrant. And that's why I said, aha, I don't want them to think little of our program. Hey, it didn't work. It wasn't helpful, because it wasn't our fault. It was they didn't know what to do with it.
Right.
And so the analytics that we come up with, I hasten to add, that's like a thermometer. That tells you what your temperature is, but it doesn't tell you what the temperature could be or how to turn the dials and increase or decrease certain items. You don't swallow a thermometer to get better. That's what doctor or sharp practice administrator or consultant does to help guide you through that. But it's interesting with my business background, diving deep into the inner workings of a dental practice combined with my technology background and my master's in business administration gives me a more holistic view of combining the latest in technology also with the practice analytics and knowing what it takes to run a practice. Well, in fact, we do a profit leaks analysis report that we would do complimentary for your listeners if they reach back out to you, and would be glad to do that for their practice. I'm kind of simple, so I like to keep it simple. And so I divide practice success into 3 columns, 3 Ps: patients, production, and profit. Until patients show up, nothing happens, guys. And so we got to have patience. But I want you to have the right kind of patience. I don't want you to be going to the study club next month bragging you finally had 100 new patients last month. And so that's some kind of milestone. And then some old codger in the back is going to say, yeah, but how many of them needed any work? How many of them wanted to buy what you are selling? If you're just a drill fill PPO bill kind of practice and you're on roller skates and working out of 2 or 3 chairs, high volume, that's fine, no problem. One thing to keep in mind, though, is talk to some of your comrades who are 40, 45, 50, 55 years old. Dentistry is a surprisingly physically difficult job after a while, many, many years of bending over, et cetera, et cetera. If you're on the other end of the spectrum, let's say a fee-for-service practice or a wannabe fee-for-service practice, or you want to do higher end cosmetics, crowns, things like that, and not be interfered with by the insurance company or limited by the insurance company, then you need those kinds of patients. One thing I was telling folks is I love the idea of teledentistry, but perhaps not for the reason you think. Maybe a third of it would be to do, in fact, some clinical observations and a quick look at somebody's mouth on their iPhone view or whatever. But the second third is I want you to have somebody nice in your practice who's bouncy and sweet and smiling a lot so that it's a marketing tool. I want you to convince the person on the video call, hey, this practice looks pretty nice. She may even give them a little video tour or something like that. I want you to sell them on the practice. But the third most vital element is I want you to have a view of the patient so you may triage patients who are not a fit for your practice. And so I wouldn't have the doctor initially on a video call. Your team member may finally call you in and say, doctor, I think we have somebody here that may have some special needs or whatever. The doctor gets on possibly. It could be your treatment coordinator, up to you. But somebody would say, patient John, looks like you may need a couple of crowns. Of course, we don't know until you get in, and we don't know what kind of crown. You may not realize there's more than one kind of crown, patient John. And for full transparency and to give you an idea of what our practice is like, the average cost for crowns ranges from, say, $1,200 to $1,600. If patient John just nods and says, then that's encouraging. But if patient prospect John turns white and says, well, now, I thought I saw a billboard on the interstate 2 exits back that said crowns were $400. Now you know you have a disconnect, that they may not be a fit for your practice. If you will be doing crowns for high volume, lower cost, no problem. But here's where you could gently discourage them perhaps for coming to your practice, because you realize they're on a different level than you. They may not appreciate the quality of what you do, et cetera. And so to me, the most important third was triage these patients before they even come in and take up an hour of your chair time, your PPE supplies, et cetera, et cetera. And to me, that would be huge. You've done everybody a service, including the prospective patient who just isn't a fit for your kind of dentistry.
Okay.
The scariest job in the office is to be the appointment coordinator. They know from past battles and bruises, the doctor hates to see an opening in the schedule. All you have to sell is chair time. So that's extremely valuable. That's why triaging prospective patient John in advance was so critical. However, a lot of doctors would rather have junk in the schedule than an opening. They're afraid to death of the fact that they need a lot of patients to fill their schedule a lot. Mm-hmm. And they end up with a lot of junk in the practice where they're not going to be patients who are consistent with your vision of the practice, the kind of dentistry you want to practice. Again, if you're high volume and you got, 12 chairs and 3 associates and stuff like that, and you need volume to drive the machine, that's one thing. I've told Laura the story about how the jungle gym hunter captures a certain monkey in the jungle. He puts a cage on the floor of the jungle where the monkey's known to run by, and the cage isn't for the monkey. They put a banana inside the cage. Well, the monkey comes trooping down the path, sees the banana, sticks his hand inside the cage, grabs the banana, and then tries to get his hand out. Well, the monkey can't get his hand out of the bars while he's holding on to the banana. The monkey would rather have the banana at all costs. And so he's still sitting there 3 hours later holding that banana, and Bawana Jim comes along and drops the net over him. To me, that's the same way that a lot of doctors think, a lot of practices think. By gosh, we will fill the schedule, but you've been around enough that you realize there's some revenues you don't want.
Right.
Difficult patients won't cooperate, won't accept your treatment plan. They think they're limited $1,000 a year by their insurance, don't understand what you do and how you are different from the other dentists down the street. Because remember, to the public's mind, if you graduated from dental school, you're all alike. Remember the doctor at the bottom of the class, he's still called doctor. The doctor who is trying to game the system with PPOs and trying to let the accounting process, the bottom line, be governed by, outside investors or whatever, and not clinical quality, skill, care, judgment. You've got to decide where you fit. But I would rather have an empty spot on the schedule than have garbage in there just for the sake of garbage. So let go of that banana possibly. But patients, we have to get in the chair, but again, the right kind of patient. So that's the first column.
Love it.
The next column, so once we've got them, what's the production? Back to our young whippersnapper that went to the study club and bragged he got 100 new patients. Yes, he had 100 new patients, but it looks like he only averaged about $2 per patient visit. He had a lot of volume, but I say that going through maybe PPOs and things like that with those kinds of patients, You have a lot of volume, but that's sort of like trying to eat soup with a fork. You get a lot of action, but very little results. And so it's important to have a standard in your office, perhaps of how much you're producing per day is a good benchmark, or how much you're producing per hour. Those are great benchmarks, but remember that only applies internally to your practice. You can't compare that to the person down the street or an article in dental economics, because how many hours is in your day compared to these other people you're looking at? You may have 6.5 actual patient hours. They may have 10 hours in a day. Well, that would sure skew the numbers on your daily production. So again, internally, you know you're shooting for, let's say, $5,000 a day. You know, based upon how you define the day, if you're better or worse than that. But comparing yourselves to somebody else is always scary. And I emphasize that averages are interesting, but I really hate averages. I tell people, look, on average, if you stick your feet in the oven and your head in the refrigerator, on average, you feel pretty good. But I'd hate to be the feet and the head. And so averages are interesting, but you've got to make sure you're comparing apples to apples. Same with production per hour. How many chairs do you work out of? The gal down the street may be working out of 3 chairs. So they produce $900 per hour. You may, for some reason, only work out of 1 chair. So you only produce $400 per hour. Apples and oranges. When you see some of these surveys that talk about, well, the average doctor produces $350 per hour. Well, first of all, how did they define production? The only way, the gold standard to define production across practices is what was the UCR standard equivalent production today. Now, you may write some off because of PPOs, et cetera. But if you post your net PPO fee to the patient file, as you can, to the ledger, you would skew the numbers compared to somebody else who's posting the UCR fee to the patient and then having big write-offs like we used to in the old days. So be careful, how are they defining production? The other thing is, who's included in that pot? You have high-end cosmetic practices. You have good old basic but fee-for-service practices. You have practices that are 50% PPO. You have government practices. And you throw that conglomeration together, that starts to sound like head in the oven and feet in the refrigerator. That average is worthless because you know, wait a minute, I'm producing $800 an hour. What in the world is this $350 figure? So again, that's where an outside advisor, consultant is often important, or talking to the right people to compare apples to apples. So there's your production. Let's say you've figured out all the math there, and we want to look at really number of patient visits and production per patient visit. Those are the golden standard. We don't care about production per day as you compare to others. We don't care about production per hour as you compare to others, but number of patient visits and production per visit ultimately drive what you're going to produce. Okay. So you may have a high number of patient visits, like the young whippersnapper with 100 new patients that month, got a huge number of patient visits, 300 patient visits. But we look at the production per hour, it's only $2, or excuse me, per patient visit, it's only $2 per visit. And so there he is eating soup with a fork. Somebody else may only have 100 patient visits, but they're producing $800 per patient visit. So that's how they're producing production. I think I would like the latter. And so how do we get the production per patient visit up? And that's where we move on to look at, what is your procedure mix? Are you doing a lot of buccal pit amalgams? Are you doing crown and bridge? Are you placing implants, restoring implants? So what is your procedure mix? And what will the demographics within, let's say, 5 miles of your office, what will those folks appreciate, understand, and are willing to pay for? We had one consultant who is working with a practice that is totally government. And of course, they don't have very high reimbursement. And this person's trying to fine tune their practice. And we came back with our suggestion through the consultant. I think the biggest thing, the best thing they can do is sell the practice and move. The demographics, their style with the government programs, you can't change that. You're simply rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. Just like it might take 3 miles to turn a battleship around, it would be a huge labor to drop all of a sudden the government or blend that in with the fee for service. No, you can't even do that. So we've had people, in fact, realize their demographics have changed. They have another 10 years to practice. And some of them physically moved 25 years away, perhaps doing a zip code study of their patients that can appreciate and pay for what they want to do. And they chased those people 20 miles away and had a fantastic time of it. So we want production per patient visit. And the last P is profit. I don't mean overhead. 90% of your problem is not overhead. I mean, I assume you're not throwing supplies out in the street and doing stupid stuff. You're probably doing reasonably well with the overhead. But one thing is, I'll bet for comparison purposes, you may be measuring your overhead wrong, or you're measuring it against an improper standard. Remember 30 years ago, the rule of thumb was dental supplies should cost 6% of your production. And here you are at 9.3% of production, or collections, I should say, or net production. And so you're always walking around mad at your supply rep. My gosh, we're wasting too much money. What are we doing here? We're throwing out alginate and wasting things. We say, wait a minute. Your QuickBooks shows you your collections to start the profit and loss, and everything's based on collections. That's convenient. And that's fine if you use the right number. But how about this? Let's say you've got 2 offices in the doctor building together, 2 practices side by side. One of them is fee for service. He produces $1 million. Let's say he collects $1 million. And so his dental supplies run 6%. Your practice has a lot of PPOs. To collect $1 million while you're eating that soup with a fork, you've got to produce at standard fees $1.5 million. You write off $500,000 due to reduced reimbursement rates from the PPO. Well, keep in mind, production is what creates overhead. Collections pays the overhead. You have to have chairs, supplies, team, etc., to support $1.5 million worth of production. It's not the supply rep's fault, or your office manager's fault. You can only collect $1 million of that because you're accepting PPO fees. Well, you can imagine in your office, you have the same dental supply ratio, really. If you take your dental supply costs and divide it by $1.5 million of UCR production, you're right around maybe 6%. But if you divide it by your collections, which is the easiest way to do it, you're at 9%.
Right.
9% is in fact appropriate if you measure it based on collections. We measure it both ways, based on production and collections, but your CPA, your QuickBooks, really doesn't normally have access to your production because it has nothing to do with the IRS. And your profit and loss statement really is designed not to manage your practice, but to do a tax return. And so we coach people also, and we're prepared to give you a sample QuickBooks chart of accounts if you'd like to redesign your QuickBooks into more of a practice management tool. But the biggest thing in the profitability area is you're writing off $300,000 of PPO reimbursement before you even get to the starting line. And that 300,000 would have dropped straight to your bottom line as pure profit. And so that's one more reason that Laura and I are on the warpath in the right circumstances to convince you, let's get out of these PPOs. On the getting out of PPOs, before you turn white and turn off the podcast here, we have case after case after case where they've done that successfully. Most doctors fail to appreciate just how much their patients love them and trust them, especially if they've been with you, a number of years. They're already driving past 10 other offices to get to you. Don't underestimate the power of that. If you're going to drop PPOs, we suggest you have a 6 or 9 month, maybe a year campaign to chat with the patients one-on-one, just for a minute or two. Sally, I'm just so excited that you've been in our practice. Do you realize it's been 10 years? Thank you for placing your confidence and faith and trust in us. I just want to let you know that we appreciate you. You can continue to trust us to do what's done and that we're clinically qualified to do. And we will never, ever treat you like that PBS Frontline special you saw a couple of years back, where they were naming names and really showing how underhanded some dental offices are out there. What you might do is go look for Dollars and Dentists PBS Frontline special on YouTube, or let me give you a link to that, and take a look to see that all dentists are not the same in their business plan and their care of patients. But I want you to know we will never, ever treat you like that. And so they had that conversation. A year later, in this one particular case, they dropped Delta and all the others. And a year after that, if they lost about 45% of their patients, they would have broken even. If they kept 55%, they'd have broken even. It'd still be better because they wouldn't have to put up with some 18-year-old at Blue Cross dictating what their treatment plan can be. But practice after practice generally seems to keep over 80% of those folks. Folks, you can do it. Others have done it. But before you pull the plug, you need to talk to somebody like Laura and determine, are you ready for that? Not just clinically, but maybe only 20% of the dentists out there are really capable of doing an old-fashioned fee-for-service practice because it's not sufficient to have the best crown margins in town. The patient doesn't know or care. So being the best dentist in your class isn't going to cut it. You have to have personal relationship skills.
Yes.
You have to have emotional intelligence. You have to understand the personality styles. You have to have a great team and build the team up. In short, you've got to be a great leader and a pretty darn good technician clinically to pull that off. And that's where you need to study some of the softer sides of your practice. And really, that's where a consultant or Laura or going to classes will focus on those things because, the old football coach, Vince Lombardi, says, if you're not keeping score, you're just practicing. Well, DentaMetrix and whatever else you use to look at your numbers, that's the way to keep score. But like I said earlier, that's just a thermometer. That tells you where you are. It doesn't tell you how to change the numbers to what you want to be. So it really is the soft side, the leadership skills, the communication styles, the ability to, quote, sell dentistry, the team building, that type of thing. That's really what finally moves the numbers. You should have the confidence to use the 4-letter word tell. Your job And maybe you want to even get the patient's permission. Sally, I know you're here for the toothache on number 13. While I'm poking around, would you like me to share anything else that I'm fine? Oh, yeah. Your job is to tell the patient what you found. Don't be x-raying their pocketbook on the side. Don't be trying to anticipate what they might appreciate or not. Your job is just to tell them what you found, and don't hit them with sticker shock. And Sally, there are a couple of things here that are pretty darn important. A number of things we could put off for a while. In fact, we could probably put together a 2 or 3 year treatment plan scheme from what I'm diagnosing here to make it financially feasible for you, et cetera. But there are a few trouble areas that could really be a problem, maybe with your gums, some perio. You're familiar perhaps with the CDC a number of years ago coming out with studies showing that the inflammation in your mouth, as with elsewhere in your body, actually is systemically related to your heart and things like that. So those are some new things we've learned. And you have some pretty darn large fillings in here. And believe it or not, those things oftentimes will last for years, as these have. But with this other tooth we want to work on, we could put a filling in there, or composite, whatever you choose. But really, if this was my spouse in the chair, I'd probably suggest that a filling may be a short-term solution, but I'd rather really put a crown in there if we can, because I don't want you out in the woods or on the Appalachian Trail and this thing fails at 2 o'clock in the morning because we only put a filling in there. And so the crown really is the best way to go, but we'll certainly do whatever's in your budget and whatever you feel most comfortable with. But it's just my job to point out the range of options you have, sort of a good, better, best approach. And you'll be surprised at the number of people who say, well, I want the best, that you had no idea. We had a young doctor years ago, had some farmer come in with his Brogans, pulled up as an old Dodge pickup truck from the 40s. And the dentist was obviously stumbling around as to what should he tell this guy he needs, which was a number of considerable things. And this old farmer wasn't stupid. He finally sat up in the chair and said, son, I bet you don't think I can afford what I need to get done. And they whipped out a big roll of $100 bills and was prepared to pay the kid in cash. So do not, please, try to outguess what your patients want and or can afford. And you've got the third-party financing to help with and things like that. I want you to nail your flag to the flag post. You show them clinically what they need. And for goodness sakes, don't be stuck with the low reimbursement that you're slave to with the PPO plans, where the accountants are essentially driving your bottom line and limiting what you can do clinically. That's one more intangible reason to please consider getting out of those PPO plans to put you back in charge. Surprisingly straightforward. In the practice analytics, it's a 5-page report where we put in some dialogue to explain what or why is this metric important and what's the action you should take in relation to it. And so I don't think it's all that difficult. We have videos built in for tutorials and things like that. So it's not all that difficult. The issue oftentimes is, and I taught for Medical College of Georgia and Chapel Hill Dental School, taught practice management and accounting type of stuff. I'm acutely aware that 85% of the dentists are scientists, essentially biology, et cetera, but they went to dental school primarily to be healthcare providers, not bean counters. I know that. I know they don't rush to the mailbox to get their latest financial statement, but this is sort of second level, second generation practice analytics, because we don't have to care how well you're using your system. For instance, 85% of the practices don't seem to use the treatment plan module in their software. We're not going to throw up our hands and say, well, if you don't use your program right, that's just garbage in, garbage out. I said, no, I'm an engineer. I was a CPA for 40 years. I know you don't use your program fully. And so what we did was we developed artificial intelligence. So if you're not doing it, we go in And we can see what was diagnosed when, we can track it. So we create virtual treatment plans. We then track to see if those got scheduled and completed. And so we can do a lot of that for you and not have to have you know how the watch was made. And so we'll go through some examples next time, but Laura could give you a free doctor sample if you'd like, if you're curious as to what's going on there. And let us get on for 10 minutes. And that's it. Doesn't interfere with your system at all. And that type of thing.
Terrific. Thank you, Rick, for sharing that and offering that up to our audience. Appreciate that very much.
A lot of doctors, again, they're so busy being busy. They don't care. They don't observe. I say that they're in a mode where they're practicing by default and not by design. You know, if you have a 55-gallon drum of water, drinking water, and you put a tablespoon of gasoline in that 55 gallons of water, you've just rendered the entire 50 gallons undrinkable. I want you to make sure that you have the right people on the bus who support your culture, and that the people on the bus are sitting in the right seat so they can do their highest and best. So you've got to get the right people on the bus in the right seats and be a leader. So get the culture right. And then back to my teledentistry, make sure new patients you accept are going to honor and appreciate the culture you have. If not, wait till the next patient comes along. It's scary when I see a practice that brags about how many patients they get off the internet. Remember, your patients love you more than you realize. And if they don't necessarily enhance your personality skills and your relationships, because that's what counts, and understand personality styles.
It's always a pleasure to learn from Rick's wisdom, and I appreciate his generosity in offering a complimentary profit leaks analysis to our audience today. Use the flow code to schedule your discovery call.